There are countless movies where a paranormal force turns out to be someone hiding in the home. It could be a demon, a crazed boy, or any other play on the trope as long as there are enough jump scares. However, in 1987, a true crime story played out that made all of this a reality. The murderer here is scary enough for any horror movie, and the twists and turns are shocking. In today's video, we'll follow the tale from start to end and see why this was so hard to solve. In the late 1980s, a teenage girl called Annie Andrews lived a fairly normal life with her sister Jessica and her father Brian. Her father was a widower and subsequently out of the house a lot to work extra shifts to make ends meet, leaving the two girls alone at home unsupervised. So far, this story is normal enough, but Annie would soon meet a boy that would terrorize her life. It all began with a simple phone call. One day the phone rang, and Annie discovered a boy at the other end who introduced himself as Daniel. The pair instantly connected, with Daniel saying all the right things to enthrall a teenage girl without giving himself away. He insisted he was from another school, and they had a mutual friend. Today, that line would be a red flag. There are often jokes about the "my girlfriend goes to another school" energy of teenagers trying too hard to fit in. But here, it worked like a charm, and the pair spoke every day. Annie was keen to meet this tall, blonde, and handsome stranger at the other end of the line, and so they did. First impressions weren't great. Daniel wasn't the heartthrob he'd made himself out to be at all. But Annie gave him a chance based on their connection over the phone. Second impressions were even worse. He seemed like a different guy and upset Annie when he asked about her mother's death. She called off the date and the relationship then and there. That should have been all there was to this story. Teenage boy oversells himself, fails to impress, gets rejected, and moves on. However, we wouldn't be covering this story today if there wasn't a bigger twist to the tale. We specialize in the weird tales of true crime and twisted murderer personalities. Hopefully, you're a subscriber already, so you know the sort of vibe we're talking about. If not, don't forget to sign up and hit that notification button for alerts to our new content. There are disturbing layers to this story, and it all continued a week later with a really spooky night in. Not long after the awkward conversation with Daniel about her mother's death, Annie began discussing it with her sister. This led to a fairly harmless decision to use a Ouija board to try and reconnect with her. This isn't that strange for teenagers going through this sort of grief. What was strange, however, was the response. The pair began to hear tapping sounds and feared it was a message from beyond the grave. To make matters worse, the tapping persisted long after the Ouija board was back in its box. It drove them mad, especially when it conveniently stopped whenever their father was at home. Their father was sympathetic and saw it as a desire to be close with their mother, and nothing more. Then the paranormal activity began. Furniture began to change positions. Things went missing, and there was no obvious explanation. It all culminated in a blood-tinged message on the wall that read, "I'm in your room. Come and find me." Wisely, they left the house, ran to a neighbor, and called their father. Unfortunately, their father believed it to be nothing but an attention-seeking stunt and a sign of their failing mental health. They went into counseling in the hope that this would solve the problem once and for all. Of course, it did nothing of the sort. The tapping continued, and so did the messages. Eventually, their father came home to find the house a complete mess and a different sort of message on the wall. All it said was, "Marry me." There was no longer any sort of pretense that this was a message from their dead mother. This was someone else trying to get at Annie in the most sadistically torturous way possible. It was Daniel. On the night that Brian Andrews found the new message and realized his kids were telling the truth all along, Daniel finally revealed himself. The problem was, this wasn't some messed up teen laughing that he'd been caught red-handed with a bottle of ketchup. Instead, he just stood in the corner of the room, saying nothing. He was wearing a white dress, Annie's mother's wedding dress, and holding a hat. Brian managed to take the hatchet and protect his daughters, chasing Daniel in the process. But then Daniel suddenly disappeared. There was no sign of him leaving the home or heading through the neighborhood. And you would expect the neighbors to pick up on a deranged teenager in a wedding dress. So, where did he go? Remarkably, he was still in the house and had been the entire time. When the police came to search the crime scene and solve the case, they noticed there were holes in the walls and the potential for small crawl spaces. One of those was right behind the dresser in Annie's room, and that's where they found Daniel. It turned out that he had been hiding out in there for 2 months straight, ever since Annie rejected him. Daniel hadn't been able to let her go after all those phone conversations. He was obsessed to a dangerous level, and it all culminated with the disturbing proposal in the dead mother's dress. He had made those noises all through the house by traveling through the passageways. He had taken the food and moved the furniture to scare them for 2 months. It's unclear how far he would have gone and how long he would have continued the charade. There is one final twist to the Annie Andrews story that makes this even more horrifying and explains a missing piece of the puzzle. We started this with Daniel calling Annie with that fake persona, but we never said why he called her. What started that fascination with Annie over other girls in town? Well, it turns out that Daniel had broken into the family home, seen a picture of Annie, and decided he wanted to get to know her better. This was a common trait with Daniel, who used burglaries as an outlet when dealing with mental health and learning difficulties. He liked the idea of being powerful enough to make people paranoid. Medics diagnosed Daniel with hyperactive disorder and had suffered countless experiences of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse as a child. We can't use this to excuse what he did to Annie, but it goes some way to explaining his mental state. There was no support for him in the 1980s, and he continued with his break-ins and cries for help. Sadly, this lack of support led to a second horrific tale in his saga. Most villain-in-the-wall movies have some sort of sequel or spin-off due to the popularity of the first. They don't always meet expectations and fall flat compared to the original. However, the sequel in the Daniel LaPlante story is the complete opposite. The Gustafson murder story was sad and arguably preventable given Daniel's past and relationship with the authorities. He could have been in care and rehabilitation. Instead, he took his actions further, with fatal consequences. He stole a handgun and went to his neighbor's home, where he assaulted and shot the pregnant Mrs. Gustafson before drowning her children in the bathtub. The police immediately suspected Daniel and found evidence at his home, including the murder weapon and some stolen items. He had fled to the woods and even tried to get someone to drive him away, but he was soon caught. Despite his age, the court tried him as an adult and sentenced him to 3 consecutive life sentences for the 3 deaths. He'll be eligible for parole in 2032. This is a big question that we can't overlook when talking about this true crime investigation. Would Daniel have gone on to be a murderer if the authorities and medics had provided the very best care possible? Or do you think he was destined to continue with this life of crime, even if the Andrews family had been able to solve this sooner? As always, we love to read your thoughts on the story.
Where is your emergency?
Yes, my son might be. He apparently has a gun and he's heading toward the Old National at on Main Street here in Louisville.
Main Street, Old National?
Yes, and this is his mother. I'm so sorry. I'm getting details secondhand. I'm running to it now. Oh, my Lord. I don't know what to do. I need your help. I think he's never hurt anyone. He's a really good kid. Please don't come up to him.
Okay, you said he was headed to the Old National Bank. Did he say what he was going to do there?
I don't know. I don't know anything. We don't even own guns. I don't know where he would have gotten a gun. He must have gotten
Okay, so where did you get this information from? Who told you what's going on?
His roommate called me. What do I do? Just go there?
No, I don't want you to go to the location, okay? No, I don't want you to go to the location, ma'am. Okay?
We're going to the location.
Right, I don't want you to go to the location. We have a situation that's going on down there right now. We've already had calls from other people, and I do not need you to go to the location at this time, okay? It's dangerous there.
You've had calls from other people, so he's already there?
Yes, at Old National Bank on East Main Street, we have.
Mass shootings are all too common in America right now. It's become so easy for them to get lost in the news cycle as another one occurs in another state. It takes something interesting to keep people talking. And that's the case with the recent Louisville bank shooting. In this video, we're going to take a look at the gunman behind the shooting and his possible motives. We also want to know why he felt compelled to broadcast it to the world. He isn't the first to do so, but why him and why there? On April 10th, 2023, a gunman entered the Old National Bank in the center of Louisville, Kentucky, and opened fire. 5 people died from the rapid gunfire from the AR-15 style semi-automatic rifle. The victims included bank workers aged between 40 and 64. 9 other people sustained injuries in the incident, including a rookie officer attending the scene. The incident was short as police responded within 3 minutes and took down the gunman. It all took place at around 8:30 a.m. as the bank was preparing to open for the day. With these facts alone, this doesn't sound like that strange a crime. Armed robberies happen in banks and often lead to fatalities. Only this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. For us, this is an unexplained crime where there is surely more than meets the eye right now. If you're a regular here, you'll know we can't resist a good mystery. If you like these sorts of true crime stories, make sure to give us a subscribe for regular content and a quick thumbs up to help us out. There's a missing piece of the puzzle somewhere in this case because right now, the story doesn't make sense. The culprit isn't who you'd expect, and those close to them are in disbelief about what happened. There are so many questions as to why this happened. So, let's take a closer look at the gunman, his apparent motive, and the possible reasons for the shooting. The gunman was 25-year-old Connor Sturgeon, who had ties with the bank. He had joined a year before as a full-time employee after spending 3 summers interning for them. His online profile states that he was a syndication associate and portfolio banker there. Those that worked with him had high praise for his character from the little they knew of him. He also appeared to be well-educated. Those not familiar with Kentucky and its gun laws may wonder how a bright professional in the banking sector got a hold of a semi-automatic firearm like that. The laws are more relaxed there, and many adults over 21 can carry a gun without a license. That helps explain why it wasn't the only shooting in the city that day, but we digress. More may emerge about Sturgeon and his background in the coming weeks. There's always the potential for ties to specific groups that may have encouraged this crime. However, that isn't a known factor right now. One thing we know for sure about this case is that it was premeditated. The police found a note describing his plans for the shooting at the bank. There was no moment that morning where he just snapped, and there was no additional crime in place, such as an attempted armed robbery. Another detail we know is that Sturgeon faced losing his job at the bank. It seems he was aware of this fact, and this is the likely motive for going in there and killing other workers. Because we want to look at this from different angles, we also want to mention the potential for mental health issues. This is pure speculation based on quotes from those that knew him. His coworkers were shocked at what happened because he seems like a generally nice and easygoing person. They seem to have good professional relationships, and yet he still came in and murdered them. A former high school friend spoke about his intellect and popularity at school, where he was part of the basketball team. It was also noted that Sturgeon wore a helmet due to issues with multiple concussions. Now, repeated concussions don't automatically make you homicidal. However, there are links between traumatic brain injury and violent crime. So far, we have a story of a young, educated man that was unhappy that he faced redundancy. That's surely not enough to take a gun to work and kill everyone. We can't ignore the mental health angle, although we wouldn't want that seen as an excuse. There is, however, another aspect to this case that poses additional questions. It was all broadcast online. One of the biggest talking points moving forward with this tragedy isn't about the gunman or the nature of the shooting. Instead, it's the way in which the world found out. Shockingly, the event was live-streamed on Instagram, where anyone able to view Sturgeon's content would have seen the brutal loss of life right before their eyes. We'll never know why he chose to do this, although any online followers and access to his online activity may give some indication. The sad thing is that he isn't the first person to broadcast a murder spree or violent crime live to the world, and he won't be the last. These incidents have been going on for years. In some cases, the streams are accidental with no direct connection to the criminal. This was the case with a shooting in 2018 at a video game tournament. The tournament was part of a Twitch livestream, as is common with that platform. During the event, a gunman came in and shot 12 people, and those watching could only watch in horror or click off. In subsequent years, attackers began deliberately using these social media tools to broadcast their crimes to the world. In March 2019, there was an infamous terrorist attack in Christchurch, New Zealand, a country with strict gun control. A white supremacist from Australia traveled over to attack a mosque, leaving 51 dead. He did so while live streaming on Facebook. More recently, in May 2022, a similar situation occurred in Buffalo, New York, when a shooter targeted a market and shot 13 people with 10 fatalities. This time it all went live on Twitch. It appears that Sturgeon was following their lead and using social media to gain an audience while committing this crime. But what was the motive? With the Christchurch Mosque, there was a clear statement of white supremacy and a message to spread. It isn't one that we can get behind, but we can see the intent. The Buffalo incident is similar, as it appeared to be racially motivated, and he was perhaps making a statement to like-minded followers. So why was a young man angry at his employers so keen to get the same sort of audience? Was it to gain sympathy in the current economic climate? Was it to show capitalists that big banks can't get away with hurting the little people like that? We're completely grasping at straws here. Maybe he just wanted to be famous for it and leave a bigger impact. Of course, that opens up a bigger question about desensitization and media coverage of the shooting in a country too used to them occurring. But that's too complicated for this video. We're just curious about motive as a means of understanding how this man's looming redundancy led to such a tragedy and why it was available online. This mass murderer leaves us asking different questions than we tend to with these sorts of videos. Normally, we'll speculate on what really happened on the night of the crime, or whether there are two sides to a story. This bank shooting isn't a case where we can question whether a perpetrator was wrongfully accused, or if the timeline of events adds up. Everyone knows exactly what happened and who was to blame, because it was all there on the live stream and in the pre-written note. The bigger discussion falls on why the gunman snapped so hard and why he put the footage online. This is an interesting topic that isn't going to go away anytime soon. The instant access to online audiences makes live streaming an easy way for killers to get their 15 minutes of fame. We'd love to hear your take on this in the comments below. Do you think that Connor Sturgeon was just following trends in an attempt to get noticed? Or is something darker going to come out about his politics and past where there was a deeper motive? Right now, it all seems so extreme and senseless. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to share this with others, and we'll see you in the next video.
What would you do if your child didn't come home from school one day? If the hours turned into days, and each passing minute made your heart race with fear? For the family of 13-year-old Madeline Soto, this nightmare became a harrowing reality, a reality that ended in unimaginable tragedy. Osceola County, Florida, is a place known for its serene landscapes and tight-knit communities. But in early 2024, this peaceful county became the center of a chilling mystery that gripped the nation. The name Madeline Soto quickly spread across headlines, sparking a wave of concern and a desperate search that would end in heartbreak. Madeline was a typical 13-year-old, full of life, with dreams and aspirations like any other teenager. She lived with her family in a modest neighborhood, where she was well-loved by those who knew her. A bright student, she enjoyed spending time with her friends and had a close-knit relationship with her mother, Jennifer Soto. But on February 26, 2024, the normalcy of her life was shattered. That morning, Madeline left for school like she did every other day. She packed her bag, kissed her mother goodbye, and walked out the door. But she never made it to school. Hours passed, and when the school day ended without Madeline returning home, her mother's concern quickly turned into panic. Calls to Madeline's phone went unanswered, and after contacting the school, Jennifer was faced with the chilling realization that her daughter never arrived. According to Stearns, he left Madeline off near her school on February 26th, which led to her first report of missing. Mother Madeline found out her daughter hadn't attended school that day when she arrived to get her from Hunters Creek Middle School at around 4:30 in the afternoon. The search begins. The disappearance of Madeline Soto sent shockwaves through the Osceola County community. Local law enforcement immediately launched a search, enlisting the help of volunteers, K-9 units, and helicopters to comb through the area. Flyers with Madeline's picture were posted in every shop window, and social media was flooded with pleas for information. As the hours turned into days, the hope of finding Madeline alive began to wane. Her family was thrust into a nightmarish limbo, clinging to the possibility that she might still be found safe. But with no leads and no sightings, the case grew cold quickly. The community that had rallied together in search of the missing girl now feared the worst. Remember, if you're passionate about justice and want to see more cases like Madeline's brought to light, make sure to subscribe and join our community of true crime advocates. A gruesome discovery. Then, in March 2024, the search came to a devastating end. In a remote, rural area of Osceola County, Madeline's lifeless body was discovered. The news hit the community like a tidal wave, leaving everyone in shock and disbelief. How could this have happened? Who could have done something so heinous to a young girl with her whole life ahead of her? The details of how Madeline's body was found were kept under wraps as the investigation deepened. Law enforcement was careful not to release too much information, focusing instead on piecing together the events that led to her death. But the discovery only fueled more questions. Was this a random act of violence, or did Madeline know her attacker? Was there something in her life that could have hinted at this tragedy? The Orange County Sheriff's Office announced the arrest of Stearns on February 28th, a few days before Madeline's death was discovered, due to the distressing evidence purportedly obtained on his phone during their investigation. For years, Soto has been accused of being sexually abused by him. The sexual assault allegedly began in 2022, according to the documents. According to a police affidavit from Kissimmee, Stearns tried to restore his phone to factory settings on the day she vanished. Since the sexual violence allegedly occurred inside the family's Kissimmee home, the investigation was taken over by the Kissimmee Police Department. From Orange County to Osceola County, Stearns was moved to the new prison on the morning of March 1st. Stearns asked for legal representation and failed to answer questions following his arrest, leading Orange County investigators to speculate that he may have knowledge of Soto's whereabouts the day after. The investigation concluded that Madeline was never left near her school because of this. After shifting their attention, investigators began to piece together additional details about the events of the morning of February 26th. At around 7:35 a.m., investigators allegedly discovered footage showing the Stearns throwing objects into a trash at their Kissimmee apartment complex. The trash turned out to be the location of Madeline's school laptop and bag. Around 8:19 a.m., investigators saw Stearns driving the youngster back to the apartment complex. It is believed by OCSO that Soto had already passed away when Stearns was seen in the vehicle with her. The investigation unfolds. As investigators dug deeper into Madeline's life, they also uncovered a web of complexities that only added to the mystery. It was revealed that Madeline had been in contact with someone online, someone who at first appeared to be a friend. In today's digital age, the dangers of online interactions are all too real, and Madeline's case brought this harsh reality into focus. The investigators began tracing her digital footprint, hoping to uncover the identity of the person she had been communicating with. Could this individual be connected to her disappearance and death? The possibility was chilling. In cases like these, where the internet serves as a medium for predators to reach out to vulnerable children, the consequences can be devastating. Madeline's friends and family were interviewed extensively, providing insight into her behavior in the days leading up to her disappearance. Some friends mentioned that she had been quieter than usual, perhaps troubled by something she didn't feel comfortable sharing. But none of them could have imagined the horror that would unfold. A community in mourning. The news of Madeline's death left Osceola County in mourning. Candlelight vigils were held, and the community came together to support the Soto family in their time of grief. Madeline's school held a memorial service, where her classmates and teachers shared memories of a girl who was full of promise and potential. The outpouring of support was overwhelming, but it couldn't erase the pain of losing a child. Jennifer Soto, Madeline's mother, was inconsolable. The loss of her daughter was a wound that would never heal. In interviews, she spoke of the unbearable grief she felt, the emptiness that had taken over her life. Madeline was her world, and now that world was shattered. The pursuit of justice. With the discovery of Madeline's body, the case shifted from a search to a hunt for justice. Law enforcement was under immense pressure to find the person responsible for this horrific crime. The investigation continued with renewed vigor as detectives worked around the clock to follow every lead, no matter how small. As the investigation progressed, suspicions grew around a few individuals, but without solid evidence, the case remained frustratingly unresolved. The public's demand for answers intensified, and the pressure on law enforcement mounted. Every parent in the community was on edge, fearing for their own children's safety and demanding justice for Madeline. One of the most critical aspects of the investigation was the forensic analysis. Experts were brought in to examine the evidence found at the scene where Madeline's body was discovered. DNA analysis, digital forensics, and the examination of Madeline's belongings all played crucial roles in building a case. However, the process was painstakingly slow, and each day without an arrest felt like a day too long. Unanswered questions. As the investigation dragged on, a cloud of uncertainty hung over the case. There were many theories, but few concrete answers. Was this the work of a serial predator? Or was it someone Madeline knew and trusted? Did the online communications hold the key to solving the case? Or was there something more sinister at play? For Madeline's family, the lack of closure was excruciating. Jennifer Soto became a voice for her daughter, demanding justice and refusing to let her story fade into the background. She vowed to keep fighting until the person responsible for her daughter's death was brought to justice. But with each passing day, the hope of a resolution seemed to slip further away. The community, once united in their search for Madeline, now grappled with the harsh reality that justice might not come as swiftly as they had hoped. The case became a haunting reminder of how fragile life can be and how quickly a community can be torn apart by tragedy. This case has left many unanswered questions. What do you think happened to Madeline? Leave your theories in the comments. Your insights might help keep the conversation going. The bigger picture, Madeline's case is not just a story of a life lost too soon. It's a stark reminder of the dangers that lurk in our modern world. The internet, while a powerful tool for connection and education, can also be a gateway for predators to reach unsuspecting victims. Madeline's death highlighted the importance of vigilance in monitoring online interactions, especially for vulnerable children. The case also brought to light the challenges law enforcement faces in solving crimes that involve digital footprints. The complexities of cyber investigations can slow down the pursuit of justice, leaving families and communities in agonizing limbo. In Madeline's case, the digital trail was a critical piece of the puzzle, but it also underscored how difficult it can be to bring predators to justice in a world where anonymity is easily achieved. As the investigation into Madeline's death continues, her story serves as a cautionary tale for parents, educators, and communities. It's a call to action to protect our children from the unseen dangers that can lurk behind a screen and to remain vigilant in the face of unimaginable loss. If you found the story as heartbreaking as we did, make sure to subscribe for more true crime cases that need to be heard. Your support helps keep these stories alive. A tragic legacy. Madeline Soto's death is a tragedy that will not soon be forgotten. Her story has left an indelible mark on Osceola County and beyond, serving as a painful reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of protecting our children. As the investigation continues, the community holds on to the hope that justice will be served and that Madeline's memory will be honored by finding the person responsible for her death. For her family, the pain of her loss is a constant presence, a wound that time may never fully heal. But in their grief, they have found the strength to keep Madeline's story alive, to ensure that her death was not in vain. Through their advocacy, they hope to prevent other families from experiencing the same heartbreak and to bring attention to the dangers that can threaten our children. Conclusion: the case of Madeline Soto is one that leaves us with more questions than answers. A story of a life cut tragically short and a community left in mourning. As we await justice for Madeline, her story serves as a powerful reminder to cherish the ones we love and to remain vigilant in protecting those who are most vulnerable. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.
The story of Christopher Watts will stay in the public consciousness for a while, and not just because of the Netflix show. The court convicted him of an unimaginably brutal crime against his pregnant wife and 3 daughters. To make the case even more strange, he would then change his story more than once. But we want to talk about what really happened in the Christopher Watt case and go over those different versions of events. If the third version is true, it is hard to comprehend. Before we go into the different stories, we need to cover some important facts. On August 13, 2018, Christopher Watts' wife, Shanann Watts, and their daughters Bella, 4, and Celeste, 3, went missing. Police found the bodies 3 days later. Shanann, who was 15 weeks pregnant, was in a shallow grave at the Anadarko Petroleum Corporation, while the girls' bodies were in oil tanks. Christopher worked at the oil company, which was just 45 minutes from their home. What makes this murder case so interesting for us is the way the story kept changing over time. There are so many versions of events from the same man that we start to question what happened that night. What we know for sure is that Shanann Watts and her 2 young daughters died horrifically that night and ended up in the oil field. What we don't know is the precise order of events or why the story keeps changing. It leaves us questioning just how much of all this he premeditated and how much he improvised. If the story from February 2019 is true, and it was a premeditated crime, it is sadistic. If you're new here and this is your first video, you've picked quite a harrowing story to begin with, so prepare yourself. We cover a lot of fascinating true crime stories on this channel, many with unexplained elements. So, if you like this video, why not also subscribe for easy access to all new content? Now that we have the trigger warnings out of the way, let's start with story number 1. Straight away, we want to clarify that this is not what we believe happened in any way. This is the original story that Christopher Watts told the police to explain his actions. We're just presenting it as part of the changing narrative. The original story goes that Christopher had strangled Shanann after seeing her strangle Celeste on the baby monitor. He also claimed that it appeared she had done the same to Bella because she looked blue in the face. From there, he dumped the bodies in the oil tanks and buried his wife, An immediate problem with this story was that it came after filing a missing persons report. The day after their deaths, he gave a TV interview from the porch saying Shanann and the two girls had disappeared, and he was begging for them to come home. It wasn't long before he changed his story. Watts soon revised his story to confess that he had killed the children as well. This completely changed the narrative of the case and the perception of Watts. He was no longer a father furious at the horrific acts committed by his wife. He was instead a cold-blooded mass murderer. Police charged Watts with 9 criminal counts in total. This included the 3 murders and the disposal of the bodies, as well as the unlawful termination of a pregnancy. Christopher reached an agreement where he would plead guilty to all 9 counts to avoid the death penalty. This led to a series of consecutive life sentences for each of the 3 deaths. This is where the case takes an incredible turn. By this point, Watts was already in prison for those consecutive sentences and had no reason to confess to anything else. The world knew he had killed his children. However, in February 2019, he gave an interview with investigators and changed his story again. This time, he claimed that the 2 girls were alive when their mother died, and that he drove them out to the oil field with her body in the car. He then proceeded to smother Celeste with a blanket in front of her sister, and then killed her too. There are a couple of considerations here. There are reports that Watts has found religion since his conviction, so perhaps this new confession is a way of fully absolving himself. What else would he gain from it? Well, there is also the small detail of the Netflix documentary that aired in 2020. There would have been plenty of researchers sniffing around for a good story to make compelling television. A father that kills their wife and kids in a rage at home isn't that uncommon. A father that hatches a horrific plan to take the kids and their dead mother's body to an oil field is unique and newsworthy. This leads to the important final question of whether Christopher Watts planned this 3rd story out in fine detail or not. Reports suggest that it wasn't meant to play out this way, and that if the girls were alive at the oil field, Watts improvised much of the plan along the way. The idea that Shanann Watts' murder was premeditated holds a lot of weight. There was plenty of motive for Christopher to kill her based on circumstances around their relationship, financial situation, and future plans. Christopher was having an affair with a coworker, had been unhappy in the relationship for a long time, and was struggling with debt. The motive for murdering the daughters is different. We can only assume that the easiest way for him to start a new life and be free of them all was to kill them all. This would explain a plan to kill them all at the house and dump the bodies. It doesn't explain a decision to torture the girls by driving them out there with their mother's dead body and killing one in front of the other. There is also no explanation for the decision to conceal the girls' bodies in the tank while Shanann was in a shallow grave. A factor we haven't touched upon much so far is that Shanann was pregnant with a 3rd child Christopher didn't want. Meanwhile, he was in a relationship with another woman and looking to end the marriage. It isn't a massive leap for him to go from wanting the wife and unborn child out of his life to deciding to murder them. There is one piece of evidence that strengthens the idea of wanting to be rid of the burden. That is Christopher's previous attempt to terminate the pregnancy. There's a claim that he attempted to induce a miscarriage by slipping Shanann. He believed that with no baby in the picture, he would be able to start over with his mistress. We should also note here that no blame lies with Christopher's girlfriend at the time. She undoubtedly knew about his family and probably believed he would leave Shanann to be with her. Her absence during the case and lack of any criminal charges suggests she wants no more to do with him and had no awareness of his plans. So much of this murder case is simply incomprehensible when we look at the details of the deaths, the disposal of the bodies, and the final confession. We often look at cases of multiple homicides and wonder what must have been going through the mind of the killer to carry out these acts. What must a father be going through mentally to believe his best option is to kill his wife, drive the body with his kids to an oil field, kill the children, dump their bodies in oil tanks, and bury the wife. We assume the third story is the correct one and was a true confession rather than an attempt to entice documentary makers. The additional stories about previous crimes and attempts to harm the family support that. But we'd love to hear what you think about all of this. Do you believe that Christopher Watts is finally telling the truth and that the children were alive in the oil field? Or do you believe this is an embellishment to create a more fascinating tale for TV? Leave us a comment below. We'd also like to hear from you if you saw that Netflix documentary and what you made of that. Thanks for watching. We know this wasn't an easy one to get through.
When those who are entrusted with the responsibility of executing the law cross the line into violence, what comes next? When members of the community who wear badges and black robes become the victims of a disaster, the community is left in a state of disbelief and asking questions. On the other hand, the issue that continues to linger about this case is, why would a sheriff, who is pledged to protect, turn his firearm on some judge? The murder of District Judge Kevin Mullins by Sheriff Mickey Steins, which took place inside the judge's own chambers, has caused shockwaves to go across the state of Kentucky and beyond. This is not merely a narrative about a shooting that took place in a courtroom. Rather, it is a story about power, treachery, and the dark secrets that may fester behind the scenes of politically charged situations in small towns. In the next video, we will discuss the sequence of events that led to the unimaginable, the response of the community, and the possible factors that contributed to this fatal encounter. In order to establish the facts, who exactly was Judge Kevin Mullins? To have a better grasp on this situation, we must first establish who the various parties involved are. Kevin Mullins was a district court judge in Letcher County, Kentucky, who stood out for his high level of respect. A man of integrity who maintained a forceful but fair posture in the courtroom, Mullins was appointed by Governor Andy Beshear in 2009. He was regarded as a man of character from the beginning. His decisions were thorough, his approach was professional, and he enforced the law with a reputation that the majority of people loved. Mullins was not only a member of the community who sat behind a bench, rather, he was profoundly rooted in his neighborhood. In spite of the fact that his courtroom was the scene of a number of disagreements, ranging from family law to criminal cases, no one could have foreseen that the same halls that were designed to administer justice would also be the location of his murder by a third party. The other side of the badge is a book written by Sheriff Mickey Steins. On the opposite side of this tragedy is Sheriff Mickey Steins, a man who managed Letcher County's law enforcement for many years and served as the county's most senior law enforcement official. In 2022, he managed to win the election by campaigning on a platform that pledged to reduce the amount of crime in the area and to ensure that the sheriff's office was held accountable. When seen from the outside, he seemed to be just another lawman in a long series of elected sheriffs. However, much like many other small towns, Letcher County had its own unwritten norms, politics, and power dynamics. Furthermore, there were tales that circulated behind closed doors. A number of months before the tragic event, rumors started to circulate, indicating that tensions were present between the judge and the sheriff. But nobody seemed to care about them at all. Letcher County is a very tiny and close-knit community, therefore it is inevitable that problems will arise there. On the other hand, nobody could have adequately anticipated how dangerous these tensions would turn out to be. September 19, 2024 is the date of the fateful day. On September 19, 2024, an event that was unimaginable took place. Everything began as a typical day in the courthouse in Whitesburg, Kentucky, where the event took place. In the course of attending to their civil disputes, minor criminal charges, and the day-to-day operations of the judicial system, individuals entered and exited designated courtrooms. While he was in his chambers, Judge Mullins was getting ready to hear the cases for the day. According to the statements made by witnesses, Sheriff Steins made a request to meet with Mullins in private. A few minutes after Steins entered the judge's chambers, the sound of gunfire sounded out. No one knows precisely what was spoken behind those closed doors, but the sound of gunshots resonated throughout the room. The result was complete anarchy. Everyone in the courtroom, including the lawyers, the staff, and even the citizens, ran for shelter, confused of what had just taken place. When the law enforcement officers eventually entered the room, they saw Judge Mullins lying on the floor with a fatal wound and Sheriff Steins standing nearby with his firearm drawn. In a move that had never been done before, Steins submitted himself without putting up any opposition. After being taken into custody by his own deputies, he was taken into jail instantly, leaving the courtroom and the community in a state of profound astonishment. A town in disbelief. What could have been wrong? Both bewilderment and incredulity increased as the news of the shooting went around the community. There is no way that anything like this could occur. Moreover, why did it take place in the first place? The judge and the sheriff had been working together for a number of years. However, despite the fact that they were from separate branches of government, they often worked together on things pertaining to county law enforcement. Thus, what might have caused this connection to escalate to the point where it led to murder? Even though the inquiry was still in its preliminary phases, stories started to circulate about the likely reasons for the incident. Several others hypothesized that it was a private matter. There was a rumor going around that Sheriff Steins suspected Judge Mullins was associated with his family. More specifically, there were suspicions that the judge may have had amorous ties to both Steins' daughter and wife. Despite the fact that these assertions are still theoretical, they were sufficient to ignite a raging storm of rumor throughout the little town. Others were of the opinion that the motivation may have been political. Considering that Mullins and Steins were both influential players in the Letcher County legal system, it is not unusual for power battles to take place between them. It is possible that disagreements over legal decisions, procedures of law enforcement, and protocols in the courts have reached a boiling point. On the other hand, the fact that this debate escalated to the point of murder was something that nobody could have anticipated. The consequences of the legal problem, justice for the judge. There are more questions than there are answers as a result of the aftermath of the incident. Following the arrest of Sheriff Steins and the filing of charges against him for the murder of Judge Mullins, the judicial process is about to get underway. An investigation into the event was immediately opened by the Kentucky State Police, and the courtroom in which Judge Mullins had previously presided is now at the focus of one of the most major criminal cases in the state. As for the residents of Letcher County, they are forced to contend with a reality that is quite unpleasant. They had placed their faith in those individuals who would enforce the law and keep order, but those individuals had become victims of a heinous crime. A community that had previously held Sheriff Steins and Judge Mullins in high esteem experienced a tremendous loss as a result of their passing. There has been a breach of trust in the institutions that serve this little town, and it will take some time for this community to recover from such a severe wound. When we go further, we find out what drives those in power to engage in violent behavior. The circumstances surrounding this case give rise to a serious question. What drives persons in positions of authority to commit acts of violence? Although it is simple to believe that those in positions of authority, such as law enforcement and the court, are immune to the same impulses and emotional triggers that the rest of us are, the reality is that they are just as human as others. And when authority is centralized in the hands of a few persons without any checks and balances, such power may become potentially harmful. It is possible that the strains of small-town politics, the weight of duty, and maybe even personal grudges all came together in a fatal manner in the instance of Sheriff Steins. In this way, we are reminded that even those individuals whom we entrust with power might fall prey to the most sinister aspects of human nature. There is no one who can say for certain what Steins was thinking when he fired the gun, but the scar that his actions have left behind will not be simply erased. The bigger picture. How communities progress, the bigger picture. As the events surrounding this case continue to develop, it is essential to explore the ways in which communities, such as Letcher County, might proceed. It is possible for persons in positions of authority to violate the confidence that has been put in them, which may result in a vacuum not only in terms of leadership, but also in the faith that justice would be provided. The courthouse will no longer be seen as a site of safety and order by many residents of the community. Rather, it will be perceived as a place of tragedy. However, as the lessons of history have shown us, communities do possess the capacity to recover. Changing the leadership, conducting investigations in an open and honest manner, and maybe most significantly, making a commitment to ensuring that individuals in positions of authority are held responsible are all necessary steps. It is quite possible that this case will give rise to discussions all around the nation about the functions of law enforcement and the judicial system, as well as the safeguards that are in place to avoid such catastrophes from occurring in the future. The conclusion is that this is a tragedy that will not be forgotten. The murder of Judge Kevin Mullins by Sheriff Mickey Steins is more than simply a terrible headline. It is a sharp reminder of the intricacies of human relationships, especially among those who are entrusted with the responsibility of preserving the law. The courthouse, which was long believed to be a symbol of justice, has become the focal point of a crime that no one anticipated would occur. It is possible that we will get further information on the motivations that led Sheriff Steins to perform such a horrific deed as the judicial processes against him continue to progress. Was it a personal attack? Is it political? Or something that goes even further? Time is the only thing that can tell. After that, I would want to thank you for watching, and I will see you again soon.
Any case of mass murder is shocking to all those involved, but it's especially so when 4 young students are all murdered in their beds in cold blood. That's what happened in a student home in Moscow, Idaho. Someone broke in, stabbed them, and left. In today's video, we're going to take a closer look at this case and see what we know so far and what remains unclear. While there is a suspect awaiting trial, and this seems to be close to a resolution, there are plenty of unanswered questions about the night in question, the lack of any clear motive, and the other disregarded tip-offs. We need to establish what we do know before we can consider everything that we don't know. These are the basics. On November 13th, 2022, 4 students were killed in their off-campus home. 3 were roommates: Kaylee Gonclaves, 21, Madison Mogen, 21, and Zana Kernodle, 20. The 4th was Kernodle's boyfriend, Ethan Chapin. There were 2 other students in the home that survived, called for help the next morning, and later helped with the inquiries. There were no direct witnesses, and 1 man now faces trial. There is no doubt that this is a tragic incident for those that died, their families, and those that survived the ordeal. On paper, this could have been a horrific act of random violence or a targeted attack based on a grudge. However, as with all the cases on our channel, there are some curious twists and turns that make this more intriguing. By the way, if you happen to be new here, don't forget to give us a like and subscribe to help us out. Your support means we can keep creating content like this and getting to the heart of some shocking cases. For a long time, the police struggled to find a likely culprit and conducted many searches and interviews. Eventually, they arrested Brian Christopher Kohberger, age 28, that December. Kohberger was a PhD criminology student at Washington State University at the time of his arrest. This is not far from Moscow, Idaho, and any links to criminology always raise eyebrows. He also worked as a teaching assistant there, which says something about his character. However, there are no clear connections between him and the victims beyond this proximity to the crime scene. There is some evidence presented by the prosecution that suggests he went past the students' home a lot, but no clue as to why. He may have met them in a social or academic capacity, but his age suggests they would not have made a close connection. There is, however, the issue of the alleged stalker, which we'll come back to later. We wouldn't be here talking about this today if this was a simple case with a cut-and-dry solution. This is a case where it feels like there are a few puzzle pieces that got lost along the way. Right now we have 4 victims, 2 lucky survivors, and a man facing trial for fitting a profile and some suspicious behavior. However, the defense is already questioning the legitimacy of the evidence. There's a gap in the timeline, and questions about other suspects have faded away. Let's go over each of these issues for a moment. This is where Kohberger's defense team is ready to fight against the prosecution. There are lots of aspects to the scene and his arrest that aren't strong enough in their eyes. These include the connection to his phone, the overall description of the suspect, and the footwear. They aren't happy with the vague nature of the description of the suspect leaving the home. It talks about an athletic but not muscular build and bushy eyebrows. There was nothing that noteworthy, and many men in the area would have fit it to a degree. This issue continues along with the clothing and footwear. A big part of the arrest lies with a blood-stained Vans-type footprint left by the suspected killer. There are no apparent details about the size. In a college town like Moscow, Idaho, there were sure to have been countless guys with van-like shoes. As for the dark clothing seized by the team, this could have been inconsequential. The case against Kohberger strengthens a little with reports that not only was his DNA at the scene, but his car circled the home and his phone had pinged in the area. The defense argues that this doesn't put him there at the time of the murder, and he lived close enough for this sort of mobile ping and for someone to see his car nearby. Let's step away from the suspect for a moment and go back to the crime scene and the two survivors. There's an odd gap in the events that took place between the killings and the police report. All four victims returned home late that night from two separate nights out. Chapin and Kernodle attended a party at a fraternity house on the campus of the University of Idaho. They returned home around 1:45 a.m. on Sunday, November 13th. Mogen and Gonclave spent their night drinking at a bar called the Corner Pub in the downtown area of Moscow that night, before heading to a food truck. This was then substantiated by CCTV footage. Both pairs returned to the house at around 1:45 a.m. At 4 a.m., one survivor heard crying, opened her door, and saw a man leaving. This is where we get that description attributed to Kohberger. They returned to the room in shock and locked the door. The police report says that the four students were likely stabbed between 3 and 4 a.m., which is consistent with the sighting of the suspect leaving the home. Then there's a gap. The report states that the roommates called friends after one of the victims seemed to be unresponsive. Apparently, they thought they had passed out and didn't suspect any other foul play at that point. It wasn't until 11:58 a.m. that the emergency services received a 911 call to help them. We aren't saying that the two survivors had anything to do with the deaths. There is probably a good reason why no one realized what had happened, and why the four students lay dead for so long. But if there was an intruder in the home, and the sound of crying, why did it take so long to call for help? This is where the case takes an interesting turn. For a while, there was the notion that this was a targeted attack, although the police backpedaled on their phrasing. It wasn't clear if they thought one or more students were directly targeted by the killer. This ties in with another aspect of the case and the reports of stalkers. While the police gathered information about the crime, they ended up with a surprising amount of tip-offs about potential suspects. Some reports were questionable, and one college professor took legal action after an accusation by a student. Some questioned the ex-boyfriend that called on the night. Then there are all the reports of stalkers. While asking the general public for information, the police received around 16,500 tips talking about their whereabouts, potential suspects, and other factors. This included hundreds relating to a potential stalker targeting Kaylee Gonclaves. Now, the police investigated this considerably at the time, with the cops following up on several leads. It may be why they originally saw this as a targeted crime. There were no clear suspects identified as stalkers, and the idea was never verified. We could dismiss this as town gossip and a case of broken telephone with misinformation across campus. Still, that's a lot of reports. Also, there was an incident where two men seemingly followed Gonclaves into a local store and then to her car. This was later dismissed. Of course, there is the possibility that Kohberger is linked to this stalker situation, but that doesn't seem likely. There are issues with the prosecution's case and the evidence presented. However, there are also issues with the defense. Koberger was in the area. He was potentially scouting the place out, and he does fit the description, however vague and generic that may have been. Without a clearer case for his defense, and with such strong public feelings about the deaths, it seems he will face the death penalty. He also doesn't have a clear alibi as far as we can tell. On the other hand, what was his motive? If that was him driving past the house and checking it out, why do it? Why stab all those people on the upper floors and not the two that survived? The more we think about this one, the more questions we have. You probably feel the same way. Do you reckon that Brian Koberger was to blame for these murders and that the description and shoe print will be enough to sentence him? Or do you think there is more to this stalker situation and that this is a mistaken identity? Leave us a comment below with your views, and don't forget to share this so that other true crime fans can have their say. Sooner or later, we will have a final verdict from the justice system, and Koberger may even face death for this quadruple homicide. But unless someone finally confesses all, we may never know why he or another culprit entered the house that night.
What would you do if the person you trust the most, the person you have pledged to spend the rest of your life with, turned out to be the primary suspect in the most terrible crime that you could ever imagine? Today, we dig into the horrific and terrible tale of Scott Peterson, a case that rocked the globe and highlighted concerns about love, treachery, and justice. Please join us as we journey through this tragedy. We will be investigating the facts, the drama that occurred in the courtroom, and the emotional toll that it had on everyone involved in this iconic case. Stay with us as we unravel the layers of this case. Our story starts in the gorgeous town of Modesto, which is located in the state of California. It is the 24th of December in the year 2002, a day that ought to have been filled with Christmas hoopla and a sense of celebration. On the other hand, for one family, this Christmas Eve would be the beginning of a nightmare that would get the attention of the whole country. At the age of 27, Lacey Peterson was a vivacious young woman who was enjoying what many people would regard to be the American dream. She was 8 months pregnant with their first child, a boy whom they intended to call Connor. She was married to Scott Peterson, a guy who was both attractive and ambitious. The way they lived their lives seemed to be perfect, full of love and hope. However, behind the surface, there was a growing sense of unease. It was on that fateful Christmas Eve when Lacey vanished without a trace. The last time anybody saw her, she was out walking their dog, and by the time evening rolled around, her absence had already taken on a worrying quality. In his statement to the authorities, Scott Peterson claimed that he had gone fishing at the Berkeley Marina on that particular day. This assertion would soon be subjected to a great deal of scrutiny. If you're intrigued by the twists and turns of true crime, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you're always in the know. The investigative phase of the process. It wasn't long before the hunt for Lacey became a major topic of discussion in the media. Volunteers searched the area, and the Peterson family did their best to ensure that Lacey was found safe and sound. On the other hand, as the days progressed into weeks, the situation became more alarming. On February 18th, 2003, the worst fears were fulfilled when the corpse of Lacey, together with the body of her unborn boy, was found washed up in San Francisco Bay. An outpouring of sadness and outrage was triggered as a result of the finding of the dead. In a short amount of time, the inquiry moved its attention on Scott Peterson. The evidence against him started to accumulate, and what seemed to be a straightforward case of a missing individual developed into a complicated and controversial judicial struggle. Providing specifics regarding the evidence. As the investigation progressed, Scott Peterson's account began to fall apart. In his original statement, he said that he had gone fishing by himself on the day that Lacey vanished. However, the authorities discovered inconsistencies in his account. First and foremost, the place where he claimed to go fishing was not the same as the spot where the corpses were found. More alarming information was uncovered as a result of further research. It was a transaction that sounded unusual considering that Scott claimed to have been going on a casual fishing excursion when he really acquired a boat. On top of that, his actions caused eyebrows to be raised. It was observed by his friends and relatives that he seemed detached and did not exhibit any signs of discomfort. In addition to this, he provided a number of contradictory accounts on his whereabouts and activities on the day that Lacey disappeared. Following Lacey's abduction, Scott had a chat with her family, which turned out to be one of the most incriminating pieces of evidence. Even though he subsequently attempted to minimize the significance of his intentions to depart the nation, he was captured on tape discussing those plans. After considering this information in conjunction with the physical evidence, the detectives came to the conclusion that Scott was engaged in the murder of his wife. The 2004 conviction of Peterson for murder in the first degree in the tragic deaths of his wife, who was pregnant, and unborn baby dates back to many years. Life without parole was the new punishment meted out to Peterson after he had already been condemned to death. A proposal to have a fresh trial in 2022 was denied. Missing since Christmas Eve 2002, 27-year-old Lacey Peterson was 8 months along in her pregnancy when she was reported missing. Allegedly, Peterson murdered Lacey sometime between December 23rd and December 24th, and then disposed of her corpse in the Berkeley Marina by dumping her body off his fishing boat. On March 12th, Peterson is scheduled to participate in the hearing over Zoom, while attorneys from the Los Angeles Innocence Project will be present in person before Judge Elizabeth Hill. Peterson, who is now 51 years old, has been behind bars for more than 2 decades. Another crucial point in the inquiry came when Amber Fry, the woman Scott had been having an affair with in secret when his wife vanished, called the police. The Netflix documentary series allowed Fry, a single mother at the time of her meeting with Scott in November 2002, weeks after a friend had seen him at a business conference in Anaheim, California, to break her silence and recount their meeting. A drama in the courtroom. There was a media circus around the trial of Scott Peterson. An overwhelming number of journalists, legal experts, and spectators were present in the courtroom. The prosecution created an image of a man who had painstakingly planned and carried out the murder of his wife in order to get out of his duties. Their argument was that Scott's actions and the evidence led to a crime that was committed with premeditation. However, the defense argued that Scott was being framed and that the evidence was circumstantial. They also said that the evidence was circumstantial. The argument that they presented was that the prosecution's case was constructed not on solid evidence, but rather on guesswork and emotive appeals. The trial was not just a war of facts, but also a struggle of views held by the general public. Scott Peterson's manner, the way in which the media portrayed him, and the emotional effect that the situation had on Lacey's family were all key factors that contributed to the formation of the narrative. In the course of the case, which became a national spectacle, people were split about whether Peterson was guilty or innocent. Love diving deep into the world of true crime? Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications to join us for more compelling cases every week. The decision and its consequences. A long-lasting impression was made on the public mind as a result of the Peterson case. It brought to light the nuances of domestic abuse, as well as the risks associated with investing unquestioning faith in the people we care about. Additionally, it brought up concerns about the influence that the media plays in determining the results of court cases and the ethics of high-profile trials. Some concluding regards. There have been 2 competing films uncover new information about Scott Peterson, a former death row convict who is now fighting to clear his record 21 years after his pregnant wife Lacey Peterson died. The tale of Scott Peterson serves as a sobering reminder that not everything is as it seems, and that the individuals we believe we know the best from a personal standpoint may often be hiding the most sinister secrets. It is a case that continues to fascinate and horrify us, and it leaves us with a frightening question. How well do we really know the people who are closest to us? With that being said, I would like to thank you for watching and wish you a pleasant evening until we meet again.
A promising young medical student disappeared after spending the night out with pals. His family had been looking for him for nearly 10 years at that point, and they never gave up hope despite having no solid leads to follow. Do we assume that he simply uprooted his life and moved on? Is it possible that he took his own life? Is there a less obvious, more sinister explanation? The Vanishing of Brian Schaefer is the name of this week's episode. American medical student Brian Schaefer, born on February 25, 1979, attended The Ohio State University. After going out with friends on the evening of March 31, 2006 to welcome spring break, Brian became separated from them, and they assumed he had returned home. At after 2 a.m. on April 1st, a security camera outside a bar in Columbus saw him having a brief conversation with two ladies before returning to the establishment. Since then, Brian has not been contacted. The matter has been covered extensively by national media. Investigators have had a hard time making sense of Brian's disappearance because there was only one alternative way out of the bar at the time. Columbus police have various hypotheses about what happened. One of them involves a buddy of Brian's who was with him that night but has declined to submit to polygraph tests concerning the incident. The alleged smiley-face serial murderer has been linked to the case, and it's been suggested that he may still be alive and operating under a new name. Brian Schaefer grew up in the Columbus suburb of Pinkerington, the elder of Randy and Renee Schaefer's two kids. After finishing up at the local high school and earning his diploma in 1997, he enrolled at Ohio State University. After studying microbiology for 6 years, he finally earned his degree. After that, in 2004, Brian enrolled at the OSU College of Medicine. As he was in his second year at the university, his mother passed away from myodysplasia. Friends of Brian's believe that despite appearances, he is still struggling with the loss of his mother. Brian's romantic involvement with Alexis Wagoner began during his time in medical school. She and their loved ones assumed that Brian would pop the question to her sometime in 2006, possibly during their spring break trip to Miami at the start of April. Brian had an admiration for tropical cities like Miami because of the laid-back culture there. Despite his commitment to become a doctor, Brian has been open with his pals about his secret desire to form a Jimmy Buffett-style band. The final day of school before spring break at OSU was Friday, March 31st. Brian and his dad, Randy, went out for a steak supper earlier in the evening to celebrate the occasion. Earlier in the week, Brian's father had seen that his son had been pulling all-nighters to prepare for some approaching exams. There were some things he was worried about regarding Brian's plans to hang out with his friend William Florence, a.k.a. Clint, that night, but he didn't share those things with his son. At 9 o'clock, Brian and Clint hung out at the Ugly Tuna Saloona in Columbus's South Campus Gateway complex on High Street. Alexis had gone back to her house in Toledo to see her family one more time before she and Brian left for Miami, and Brian contacted her an hour later. After leaving one bar, Brian and Clint visited one more on their way down to the Arena District. They got a shot of strong liquor at each location. At midnight, Brian and Clint went to the Short North to see Meredith Reed, a mutual friend of theirs. Reed drove them back to the bar where the evening had begun, the Ugly Tuna Saloona, and they all went in for one last drink. Brian ended up going off on his own while the other three were there. Clint and Reed looked for Brian and called his name several times. After the pub closed at 2 a.m., they departed with the other customers and waited for Brian outside. But he wasn't there when everyone else left, so they figured he'd gone home without telling them. After that weekend, both Alexis and Brian's dad called, but got no response. He was supposed to fly to Miami with Alexis on Monday morning, but he ended up missing the trip. The police in Columbus, Ohio, were then notified that he was gone. The police started looking for Brian at his last known hangout, The Ugly Tuna Saloona. Because of the high crime rate in the neighborhood surrounding South Campus Gateway, the pub has installed surveillance cameras. Brian, Clint, and Reed were seen at the bar's main entrance around 1:15 a.m. on the surveillance tape. At 1:55 a.m., Brian was captured on CCTV waving goodbye to two young women before walking out from the establishment. Soon after that, the Ugly Tuna Saloona shuttered, and that was the last time anyone saw Brian. Because one camera had to be controlled manually and the other was constantly panning the scene, detectives concluded that Brian may have changed clothes at the pub or worn a hat while keeping his head dropped and his face obscured from the camera. According to the results of the probe, Brian may have used an alternative exit from the building. There was just one other way out of the building, and it went into a construction site that the responding police officers thought Brian would have had a hard time navigating sober, let alone drunk. They next examined videos from other pubs to see if they could piece together how Brian had departed the Ugly Tuna Saloona. Columbus has more security cameras than any other city in Ohio, more than Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Toledo combined. Nevertheless, there was no sign of him in the CCTV footage from three other establishments in the area. At the Ugly Tuna Saloona, the search spread out in all directions, with officers and canines combing the streets, checking dumpsters and other trash cans, and asking locals if they had seen Brian. His picture was widely disseminated on flyers, with many highlighting the tattoo on his upper right arm of the stick figure insignia from the cover artwork of the single Alive by Pearl Jam, one of his favorite bands. The Columbus police were even able to convince the city to allow an examination of the sewer system. There was no discovery of value. Brian's automobile was still parked in front of his King Avenue apartment 6 blocks away from the bar. On the inside, everything seemed normal. After looking for hours in every direction from the Ugly Tuna Saloona, the police began to investigate other explanations besides an accident or foul play. It was assumed that Brian had momentarily disappeared to mourn the loss of his mother alone. The fact remains, though, that he is gone for good. There seemed to be no logical explanation for his disappearance. Others who have claimed to see Brian that night were given lie detector tests, and that included his own father. In contrast to Clint, he and Reed both apparently passed theirs. It turned out that the two women who had last seen Brian with him were the ones who had denied being asked to take a selfie with him in 2009. Once Brian went missing, Alexis continued to make nightly calls to his phone. In September, the phone rang 3 times before finally going to voicemail. Even though no one answered, she kept trying to hear it since it was truly incredible, she announced on MySpace. A representative from Brian's wireless carrier, Singular, told Alexis that the noise she heard could have been the result of a technical issue. Hillard, located 14 miles, 23 kilometers, northwest of Columbus, received a ping from the phone. Several tips were given to the police, but none of them led to any new leads. Eddie Vedder, the lead singer of Pearl Jam, paused in the middle of a show later that year in Cincinnati to plead for help in solving Brian's disappearance, but no suggestions were offered. Investigations were conducted into possible sightings in Michigan, Texas, and even Scandinavia. Randy Schaefer, who had recently lost his wife, kept looking for his missing son even after she passed away. He consulted a clairvoyant who told him Brian's body was floating in the river at the bridge pier. Along with Brian's younger brother Derek and other locals who had taken an interest in the case, he acquired waders and spent much of his free time searching under bridges on the banks of Columbus's Olentangy River, which runs adjacent to OSU's campus. Because of this, the authorities briefly considered the controversial smiley face murder scenario. Based on this scenario, Brian would be the lone undiscovered victim of the alleged serial killer. The FBI and other law enforcement agencies looked into Brian's case, but the Columbus police eventually rejected any connection to the supposed perpetrator. Randy Schaefer was removing garbage from the yard of his Baltimore, Maryland house in September 2008 when a severe windstorm hit. His death was caused by a falling branch from a neighboring tree. The next morning, neighbors discovered his body and phoned the police. An online condolence book was made available after his obituary appeared. To Dad, Love Brian, U.S. Virgin Islands, read one of the autographs within. This indicated that Brian had maybe relocated his life away from Columbus. After additional examination, however, it was discovered that the note had been posted from a publicly accessible computer in Franklin County, and the whole thing was exposed as a hoax. In a letter to private investigator Dan Corbett shortly after Randy Schaefer's death, Clint's lawyer, Neil Rosenberg, expressed his client's continued refusal to undergo a lie detector test. Rosenberg hinted that the Columbus police, who were looking into the case, thought Brian was still alive. If Brian is alive, as I'm led to think after consulting with the investigator involved, then it is Brian and not Clint who is causing misery and sorrow to his family, Rosenberg wrote. Brian needs to take the initiative to end this. He said that Clint did not have anything to hide because he had already disclosed all relevant information. Despite Rosenberg's claims, many of Brian's friends and family have chastised Clint for not being honest. Derek recalled that when the detective became involved, his friend lost touch with everyone. I've always had the impression that he knows something but won't admit it. He has not given up hope that Brian is still alive, and Clint is the only one who knows where he could be. As he put it, we always simply had a strong hunch that Clint would maybe know that if Brian had indeed disappeared. Alexis agrees with Brian that he is being secretive, but she concludes that her ex-boyfriend is probably dead and hasn't simply disappeared. I can't believe he just did that, she said. In 2014, Columbus police reported getting 2 tips per month through the local Crime Stoppers hotline, but none of them had led to any new information or leads. 4 file boxes worth of paperwork was involved in the case's evidence. According to Columbus Monthly, one of the original investigators, Andre Edwards, said that after a thorough analysis of the video footage from the Ugly Tuna Saloon on the night Brian disappeared, he could state with 100% certainty that Brian did not escape through the escalator. The police had 3 possible explanations for the case, but they wouldn't talk to the magazine about any of them. In 2019, a photo of a claimed American homeless man with striking similarities to Brian began circulating online. The man was reportedly last seen in Tijuana, Mexico. The 2020 Columbus news station 10 TV that received the photo forwarded it to the investigator handling Brian's case. After sending the photo to the FBI for facial recognition processing, the detective was eliminated as a suspect. Nearly 15 years after Brian's disappearance, in March 2021, the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation released a portrait of what he would look like at age 42. When Randy was still alive, he worked with the families of other missing adults in Ohio to campaign for a bill creating a statewide protocol for incidents like Brian's disappearance and his own death. It was up to individual departments at the time of Brian's disappearance, and several family members thought that the investigations into their loved ones' disappearances worsened as a result. The bill had already passed into law when Randy passed away. What are your key takeaways from today's case? Do you think it's more likely that Brian slipped out without being spotted by the cameras? Was murdered? And then his body was hidden somewhere? I would love to hear from you by commenting below. And when you're done, you can watch more of our cases by subscribing and visiting a vast variety of options through our playlist section. It's always being updated, so check back frequently. Thank you again for gracing us with your presence.